Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Greg McGonigle. I'm the Dean for Religious Life at Emory, the University Chaplain, and delighted to have with us today the Reverend Jennifer Bailey of the Faith Matters Network, founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network, along with Rabbi Jordan Braunig, who's our Jewish chaplain here at Emory University, for our annual Office of Spiritual and Religious Life Martin Luther King Jr. Week event. Every year, the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life offers a program in which we remember the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the Civil Rights Movement. And we remember, we learn, we reflect, and we rededicate ourselves to the values and the mission really embodied in the Civil Rights Movement. And many of us have been reflecting in this month in particular. The last time I think I was in conversation, formal conversation with Reverend Jennifer Bailey was 4 years ago, which was also an inauguration time, and it was also Martin Luther King Jr. week. And we were reflecting about, the 4 weeks that, the 4 years that were ahead of us. And here we are now, also MLK week, also having experienced an inauguration, but many things in between that I think inform, how we're thinking about civil rights, racial justice, social justice in this country. And we wanted to have this conversation today, drawing on a theme from Dr. King, which is healing the soul of the nation, and really reflecting on, what did Dr. King mean by the idea of the soul of the nation? This is also a theme that President Biden, Vice President Harris have referred to in their speeches and remarks, really calling us to remember America's soul, to think about what do we mean when we say America's soul? We know we're a multi-religious country, we're a country, people of faith, people of no faith, people of deep values and convictions. What is the soul that is maybe the deeper part of who we are, that is a touchstone that we can come back to? Sometimes it feels as though politics is not what's going to unite us. We have other divisions, even among religions, for instance. But what is this idea of the soul, the American soul, that calls for healing? And so we wanted to invite you, Reverend Bailey, to speak to us a little bit today on this theme, one that we know that you work on in your organization. The Faith Matters Network is a womanist-led organization that supports faith leaders and community activists in the work of healing, dialogue, really being equipped for doing the work of spirituality and social justice today. So we're so happy to have you with us, Jen, and I would love to invite you to offer some remarks on the theme, and then have an opportunity for some interfaith conversation. Here in Georgia, we're also just really a couple of weeks after a major historic election in which the first Black senator was elected in Georgia and the first Jewish senator. And they really work together as an interracial and interfaith team. So, what does it mean to think about interracial and interfaith relationships in this time? I think many of us are thinking about that theme and how to incorporate that as leaders and educators into our lives. So, Reverend Jen, we'd love to invite you to offer your reflections, and welcome again to Emory virtually.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you to the Emory community for inviting me into this space on this most auspicious of weeks as we celebrate the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and inaugurate a new presidential administration. It's just with a deep degree of gratitude that I accept the invitation, and I'm excited to be in dialogue with you all over this next hour or so. I bring you greetings from Nashville, Tennessee, where I'm calling in from my son's nursery. I had a baby 4 months ago, and as I think about the reasons why I do this work in this season, he is certainly, my baby Max is certainly at the front of my mind as we think about what the future holds for us in this period of deep uncertainty as we interrogate our nation's soul. So to open my reflection and remarks, I'm so excited to be in conversation with Rabbi Jordan in just a moment. I thought I would take us back into time to January 10th, 1957, where in Atlanta, Georgia, that great son of Atlanta, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., gathered with folks from across the South to coordinate and form a regional organization that would really be the center source of coordinating protest activities across the South in the wake of the Montgomery bus boycott. Despite a number of bombings at the home of and church of the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, these 60 folks from across 10 states assembled and announced the founding of what would become known as the Southern Leadership Conference on Transportation and Nonviolent Integration. A few months later, in July of that year, a new name was adopted, the one that we most often think of when we think of Dr. King's work, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I went back and started thinking about the founding of the SCLC, in part because of what their motto was and what they were after as they were approaching these big questions about civil rights and social justice in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And so I thought I would quote from Dr. King himself, who in his April 1967 speech Beyond Vietnam recalled the founding moment of the SCLC in language that might feel a little familiar to us today. And Dr. King said, in 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we would not limit our vision to certain rights for Black people, but instead affirm the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of slaves were loose completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way, we were agreeing with Langston Hughes, the great bard of Harlem, who had earlier written, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, yet this oath I swear, America will be." Now, this notion of saving the soul of America, I wonder if Dr. King's ears would be ringing if he were still alive today. Because indeed, this theme about the battle of the soul of America was certainly a central theme of now President Biden's campaign. And in this week's inaugural address, I looked it up, and the term soul appears no less than 5 times in the 20-minute oration that President Biden welcomed us with during his inauguration. But it does beg the question, what is at the center of America's soul? If we indeed follow the metaphor and believe that America does have a soul, what does that soul consist of? And as I was reflecting on this question, I was reminded of a conversation I had with a dear friend of mine, Tim, several years ago in the pre-pandemic days. So several years now feels like several decades ago. If you're like me and you've felt like this year alone has felt like at least a decade since the beginning of January. Now, Tim is a devout Catholic, deeply formed by Jesuit theology, and we found ourselves sharing a drink on a summertime rooftop space. He was also preparing to welcome his own first child at the time, and his wife, with a grace and patience I did not know, allowed him to go on a month-long silent meditation retreat prior to welcoming their child. And one of the questions that Tim was really wrestling with at the time that we were discussing on that rooftop was this question of how both light and dark comprise each and every one of our souls, right? That so often we pay so much attention to the good or an aspiration towards the light, as it were, in reference to the soul. But if we're honest with ourselves, each of our souls has a shadow side. And I found that it is in my deepest relationships, particularly my relationship with my partner, that I'm most aware of that shadow side in very prickly and honest ways. And so as I was thinking about the moment we today find ourselves facing in the midst of these 4 historic crises, from COVID-19 to economic depression to the ongoing degradation of our environment, just the reality of structural racism, it's become very apparent to me that over the past decade or so, the dark side, the shadow side of American soul has been laid bare and apparent to each and every one of us. In particular, that last crisis, the question of structural racism and interpersonal racism have been at the forefront of our imagination, from the brutal killing of George Floyd, from Charlottesville to the Capitol, this rise of emboldened white nationalism, and I would argue white Christian nationalism, has been at the forefront of some of our popular imaginations about what the darkness and the dark underbelly of our soul might be. Um, in particular, as somebody who inhabits a body as a preacher in the Black church tradition, who's married to a practicing Jew, who now has a baby who we're raising with Judaism as his primary home, religious home, been thinking a lot about how much Max and the reality of who he embodies in this 4-month-old body is the very embodiment of what a lot of people say they hate. Now, I'm biased, but I think my kid is really cute, and are so many, right? But the harsh reality is that um, I cringe almost when I hear people say, when they look at what happened on January 6th, this is not America, this is not who we are, in part because it is part of who we are. And so the question before us, I believe, is not a question of denying the dark ugliness of our past or our present, but being deeply attuned to the places where there are deep ruptures in our interpersonal relationships, a deep lack of understanding of the brutality of our history, from enslavement to the mass genocide of Native and Indigenous peoples, to the ways in which we have pushed certain people, not just to the margins, but brutally and violently suppressed the quest for freedom and liberation for so many groups throughout our history. And if I'm going to be honest, it's not entirely clear to me how we craft a pathway forward that holds the truth of our multiplicity of experiences alongside some of the narratives of accountability and redemption that have become parroted so often over the last several weeks. We hear these calls for unity, these calls for healing. I don't know how to do unity and healing without a process that also involves accountability and a turning away from some of these dark realities that we're facing. But I do feel clear that one of the only pathways forward in strengthening is through strengthening our relationships with one another, through honest dialogue that reckons with the truth of our history. Now, in particular, I know that that word truth has also become a contested term over the last 4 years, when the truth is there are those of us who are living in vastly different realities, where things like facts have become disputed, where sources of news and information have been casting us further and further apart from one another. In 2017, in January of 2017, the last time that I was with Greg was when I just co-launched a project called the People's Supper. The aim of that project in the wake of the 2016 presidential election was to create spaces over shared meals for people to be in dialogue with and conversation with one another. We hosted at the time two tracks that I think are perhaps reflective of a pathway forward for us today. One focused on healing within communities that had been directly targeted by some of the violence and harsh rhetoric of that election cycle, and as a way of fortifying and helping folks come together with their folks, with their people, and strengthen their resolve and relationships. And one focused on bridging across lines of difference, political, ideological, identity difference. And over the past 4 years, what we've found in the People's Supper space, we've now hosted over 2,000 of those dinners across the country, is that in order to move forward, relationships, as they say, move at the speed of trust, but social change often moves at the speed of relationships. And if we cannot figure out a way to be in relationship with one another, I don't know that there's hope really for what a transformed imagination about what it would look like to live in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy. Because we know that America is indeed an unfinished project, one in which each generation contributes to building something different. And at a time where so many of us are in a space of deep grief, whether that is mourning the loss of a loved one due to COVID-19, or mourning the loss of an imagined future for ourselves or our family because a factory in town shut down, or the pathways towards advancement that one might have imagined for themselves are no longer viable. I wonder if part of the question of how we begin in relationship begins with a mutual recognition of the shared moment of deep grief that we find ourselves in. The question of how we heal, indeed, is a question first that is fundamentally about asking the question, what needs healing? Where are the pain points? In the words of one of our mentors at Faith Matters Network, Mama Ruby Sales, where does it hurt? Now, we are a country that is not historically good at reckoning with where it hurts. And in fact, I think culturally, we are incentivized often to forget. Because when we remember the truth and reality and breadth of our histories, we can often get bogged down by a sense of guilt. But what we know, and I think this is true for folks who find themselves pushed to the margins because of their racial identity, I also think it's true of those who have been decentralized because of their religious identity in the United States, is that there are models of mourning, models of grieving that don't just focus on the limitations of our grief, but allow grief to be a pathway towards deeper love and understanding, and the mutuality and recognition of the mutuality of human experience that is the experience of loss. See, I found in my own experience that grief, having had dear loved ones who've lost people to COVID-19 over the past year, and having experienced the death of many family members over the past 5 years, that grief is one of the ways that I remind myself that I am alive and I am part of a bigger history and story of what it means to have experienced loss, yes, but that loss opens my eye to see myself as more deeply connected to my fellow human being, which allows me to have the space and creativity to imagine what a country that emerges out of this period of deep death and decline might look like. That allows me to see that the sky could be purple one day, that unicorns may exist, that when we stretch the boundaries of our imagination and don't feel like we are limited to the realities that are immediately in front of us, we entertain the possibility that indeed the American project is one that we might be able to achieve one day. And so I just want to close with these opening remarks because I'm really excited to talk to Jordan, particularly at a time when we've seen a rise in both anti-Black racism and anti-Jewishness and Semitism, as sort of as part of the cornerstone of this moment of deep instability and white nationalism. So excited to talk to Jordan about what that means and how we unpack that from the perspective of our faith traditions. I thought it would be appropriate for me to let the last word come from that great adopted son of Georgia, the late Representative John Lewis, who in his last note to us said the following: "Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting into what I call good necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because you are not guaranteed it. You can lose it." And this is what I found so profound. "You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenge of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide." And with that, I am so excited to be in conversation with Jordan and interrogate this question even more.
Well, thank you so much, Jen. So grateful for those framing remarks that are deeply beautiful. Thank you for sharing about your family, and congratulations to you again on your son's birth. And welcome Rabbi Jordan Braunig, who's our Jewish chaplain, into this conversation as well. Jen, what you've offered here is so rich, and I've just first of all, I want to say that if people have questions or comments that they want to add, I believe the chat is live, so you're able to chat and questions, and we will we'll seek to respond and make this an interactive conversation. Jen is a true longtime interfaith leader who believes in dialogue and practices dialogue. So she rarely gives a talk, I think, without an opportunity for dialogue, and we really welcome that today. But I'm thinking about, I think the place that you brought us to, Jen, in thinking about grief and healing is a really powerful one, because I think we don't have words to fully describe what anti-Black racism, what anti-Semitism, the kind of pain that causes. I think grief is the closest maybe term that we might use. And as we think about this religiously, spiritually, I'm wondering, in the Jewish tradition and Christian traditions, are there rituals or practices for healing grief that have any lessons that might be transferable to this moment of national healing that people find themselves in with multiple pandemics? We have people seeking healing from grief on the personal and familial level and level of friends, on societal and structural levels. So I'm just curious if there are rituals, practices, themes in your traditions that relate to that.
Well, I'll begin by saying to Reverend Jen, thank you for the framing that you gave. Thank you. I'm struck by a notion that the work that we have to do is about attunement, about deep attunement to the truths of who we are as individuals and who we are as a society and who we've been. And that question that your colleagues talked about of where does it hurt, and maybe that's a starting place. And in fact, that's in terms of grief and in terms of a shared sense of loss that I think is a connecting experience across ideologies in this country right now. For me, I say to students a lot and to those who will listen to me that Judaism doesn't do everything perfectly, but it does grief pretty well. And the places where I really see that lived out are in this sort of notions of there being specific times and places for different experiences of grief. The intensity of the first 7 days after a burial is followed by a 30-day period where people reemerge into the world but aren't fully there. And then really for the first year of grief, there is a lived difference, a showing up on a daily basis to recite the words of the Kaddish, the memorial prayer. That's a big piece of Jewish tradition, but really to focus in on that Shiva period, those first 7 days. So much of what happens in a Shiva house, and if anyone has had the experience of going after a funeral to a friend or family member's house for a Shiva, it's about presence and about sitting with someone. And so when you talk about the people's supper and about there being food there and people together, and it's about listening and about presence. And I think one of the real challenges of the particular moment that we find ourselves in this pandemic moment is that presence is one of the things that's like not really possible. We're here, I'm looking at the two of you, and it's sweet and it's nice, but we all know that it's just it's a mere like taste of what it really is to be with people and to be face to face. And so the challenge that I'm finding myself faced with is, I know that in experiences of intense sadness, of even in joy, that gathering is such a balm. And right now it's hard, but maybe right now is the time for us to be really creative and thinking about, okay, how do we figure out how to be present with someone? And you can hear my kids starting to chime in as well. But how can we really be present with one another?
Yeah, and I'll just share, I'm clergy in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is the oldest historically Black Protestant denomination in the world. And in the experience of the Black church tradition in which I was raised, there is a different relationship to the Christian tradition. We often like to say that, one of my professors in seminary would say that for Black Christians, the Bible begins in Exodus and then is read through that lens rather than Genesis. So it doesn't begin with creation, it begins with a narrative of liberation at its best. And so with that reimagining at the center, I think one thing that is also true is that through some beautifully subversive practices of my ancestors, we've also retained these traditions of mourning from the continent that speak back to a pre-Middle Passage reality of what it means to commune with and be present with family and community and ancestors as part of an understanding of Black Christianity in the United States. And I think we see that most actively represented in what we call homegoing services, right? So funerals that don't just last an hour or 45 minutes and you expect people to like do their mourning, then like put them in the ground and be done. But, you know, I've been at funerals that have lasted 8-9 hours, right? That there's something about the act of tarrying in and being present with one's sorrow and grief and with the grief of others that allows for a communal collective experience of grief that then can be transmuted into something different by the recognition that one is not alone in their suffering. And so, you know, I think often about the scripture in the book of Psalms about turning one's mourning into dancing, right? That there is something about the act of being present with our mourning and grief together that allows us to move through it, not ignore it, be present with it, and transmute it into something different on the other end, a celebration of our togetherness. And, you know, it was interesting to me observing the past week that Vice President, now President Biden, started the inauguration week with a moment of collective remembrance for the over 400,000 people that we've lost to COVID-19, something that we had not seen in our public imagination over the past year in such a profound way. But I also was reminding myself that last May, in the absence of that public conversation, a friend of mine, along with a coalition of folks from across the country, just everyday folks, recognized that there was an absence of space to grieve. This was as we were approaching the 100,000 mark, which is insane to think about how many souls we've lost since then. And so we did a vigil called Naming the Loss, where for 24 hours, we just read the names on Facebook of those who had passed away as a way of marking time and honoring the moment that we found ourselves in. And so I share both of those endpoints in part to say that we could wait for our government officials or those who are in high positions of leadership to help guide us through this moment. But by and large, the most active work that is happening to help heal the soul of our nation, to help heal the soul of American democracy, happens when everyday folk get together and answer the call of what is needed and where it hurts in their communities. People don't have to wait on some permission from on high, but it's often in those quiet moments where people, one or two, are gathered and decide to do something, decide to create a mutual aid society that benefits the seniors that can't get out in their community because of COVID-19, decide to create a vigil space just to call the names of those who've been lost, that we can see some of the most powerful transformative work happening and leadership emerging. I often struggle with people who we consider capital L leaders, right? And very much more subscribe to the leadership philosophy of Ella Baker, who, you know, said that strong people don't need strong leaders, right? That everybody has the capacity in their own way to step into a space of leadership and help guide us into a collective future in which we all can see ourselves as part of that meaning-making project that is America.
How beautiful. You know, thinking about that image too, Jen, that you raised from scripture about turning mourning into dancing, it feels as though in some ways the work of healing is transformative work, right? It's taking kind of what is and trying to reshape it into something else. And every year on the day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, I think that we have an opportunity to remember and to make remembering part of that transformation. And so one question that's just on my mind is, you know, as we, you know, coming back to the theme of America's soul, are there moments in, you know, your life or in the history that you draw upon, both of you, where you really think about this idea of remembering as part of healing, or a moment in which you feel like you've caught a glimpse of the idea of what it would mean to have a soul, you know, a soul of this country that is well, or that is at least, you know, moving in that direction of transformation to to wellness and healing.
Yeah, I mean, most of the moments that I've experienced where there has been that sort of, what I would say like a spiritual awakening moment around healing have happened when like there is some sort of confession that takes place, right? So some sort of acknowledgement of the state that we find ourselves in and the brokenness that we find ourselves in. I'm thinking back to a retreat I was at several years ago, of a lot of like young millennial and emerging Gen Z spiritual leaders who are really on the forefront of thinking about the future of what religion in the United States can look like. And we were there at a retreat center, and there was another group, and there were some really interesting, like racially charged dynamics that began to emerge between our group and the other group. And we were sitting in practice one day and about to move forward without fully recognizing what had happened. There had been a moment of conflict. And my dear friends who were facilitating, who were both white folks, right, were like, we're just going to push on through. And I remember standing up and just saying, like, we need more time. We need to pause and sit with this for a second. And it was in the suspension of time, which felt cosmological in some ways to me, that people began to speak up and speak the truth of how that moment of conflict with this other group had been impactful for them, that it turned almost into like this moment of like, some people started reading poetry afterwards as a response to what they were hearing. Other people started singing. And by the end of it, we had a dance party, right? Which was not what was on the agenda for the day. And it is one of the closest moments in the language of my tradition that I felt towards tasting a bit of what the kingdom of heaven in the language of my tradition might feel like here on earth. That was only possible with a recognition of the harm that had been caused. And that is why I find myself being concerned, although we use the terminology of healing to be very central to our work at Faith Matters Network as a organization led by and founded by Black women. And I've seen the politicization of that term over the past several weeks as a way of trying to move on and move forward, and in such a way that it tries to erase the reality of the pain that many people have been in the past 4 years under the previous administration. And I worry about our use of language and the way that terms that can be very deep can become very surface level. In the same way that I often worry about the way that we remember the legacy of Dr. King, as if he wasn't one of the most unpopular people in America when he was assassinated, right? Or the fact that he was assassinated. There's almost like this, the ways in which, in particular in the American context, we like to retell stories such that we forget how deep and painful and just real, right? So things are and can be, particularly around this question of race, and as one of the core questions that we still haven't quite reckoned with, and racial injustice that we haven't reckoned with. So all of that is a way, I share all that by way of saying that I have similar concerns about like terms like bridge building, although as we think about what unity might look like, rather than conflating unity as meaning sameness, as I think we often have in the history of America, and part of what I hear a tenor of in some spaces when people want to push us towards unity, I like to imagine what we might look like to feel unified in our radical differences. And if the reality of bridge building is not about, I believe, in its truest form, should not be about us having to give up something in order to have a conversation about what our shared values might be. And it also isn't just good enough to stick with the question of tolerance in one another. That should be the bare minimum of entry to these conversations, as a colleague of mine, Simranjeet Singh, said on a conversation we had last week. And so if tolerance is the bare minimum, right, like, then I wonder what we are invited to do in this project of attempting to co-create a vision for the future together. I think people get scared to talk about, bridge building or healing to what end, right? Like we stop there. We assume that like we'll be healed and then we'll be done, but we know that violation will continue and harm continue. So thus the process is cyclical and will always continue. And so I think people are afraid that when we ask that question, to what end, we won't have the same answer, and that is a potential source of conflict. But I might like to suggest that rather than see that as an avenue for conflict, maybe it's partially an invitation to see a more complicated and beautiful tapestry of possibility. And quite frankly, there's just some folks that I don't want to bridge with in this season. Like, I have nothing to say to the white supremacists who stormed Capitol Hill. It is somebody's ministry to work with them, as many of them would declare themselves fellow Christians, right? Like, it's just not my ministry, right? It's somebody's, and I want to affirm whoever's ministry it is, but it's not mine. So I'll pause there because I really would love to hear what Jordan is thinking.
Yeah. It's so much of what you're saying resonates. This idea that healing and unity can be a get out of jail free card. Like, let's heal the divide feels to me sometimes, and I know that this is, that for lots of us there's a real question of, okay, so it feels really difficult to reconcile across these divides, and the divide feels so wide. So I think, rather than terms of healing, I use what in Judaism is referred to as tshuva, the process of what's sometimes called repentance, but really, like, in the Hebrew, means return, and hoping to return to something that's more whole than where we are, and that's true, as individuals, that we're constantly looking to sort of return to the person that we aspire to be, and as a country, we're hoping to return to something that is both better than whatever has been. I think we were all inspired by Amanda Gorman's words in the inauguration. On the same day, Emory's own Jericho Brown, Pulitzer Prize winning poet, published a poem in the New York Times, and I'll just quote a little bit of it because I thought it was really beautiful. He says, "We imagine an impossible America and call one another a fool for doing so. Grown up from the ground, thrown out of the sea, fallen from the sky. No matter how we've come a mighty long way. If I touch any of you, if I shake one hand, I am nearer another beginning. Can't you feel it? The trouble with me is I'm just like you. I don't want to be hopeful if it means I've got to be naive." And I feel like, when we talk about the soul of this country, and there's so much that has to be reckoned with, and yet we still want to be hopeful. We want to say, like, let's get to that place that we hope for. We're like, our religious traditions are powerful partly because they speak about an experience of exile and an experience of redemption, and maybe we're always in exile, and only momentarily we have those moments of redemption of the kingdom to come, or for me, like, I look back on my childhood, and I grew up in a small Jewish community in Louisiana, and one of the moments of real, like, collective effervescence that I felt like real spiritual uplift was when David Duke was running for governor, and the Jewish community and the Black church joined together to say, like, okay, we've got to stop this from happening. And that experience of solidarity was so spiritually powerful. And yet, like, I'm reminded, like, it was in response to the fact that, like, a Klansman was about to be elected governor. So it's like, that comes back to Jen, what you were saying in the beginning of, we have these souls, and if America has a soul, why should it be any different than ours? And it has a shadow side, and it has a side that is better, and the work is that work of return, and it's ongoing, and it's often steps forward and steps back, and it's painful, and I think it requires of us that we like voice disappointment. That's, you know, that's not that doesn't mean we've given up on the project if we're disappointed in it.
Absolutely. Have a question here that I think ties in from an Emory faculty member, and I think it ties into the themes that both of you have raised. They write, I've really been struggling with trying to discern between being open to people whose beliefs and attitudes are different from mine, and I believe are unjust and immoral. So believing that others' beliefs are unjust and immoral. When do we know when to stand up for justice and say no, versus when to listen and be open? And you gestured toward that a little bit, Jen, in your remarks, but curious. It's not always our time to have to take on these things, but you know, maybe for some of us, that is our role. So what would you say?
I'm reminded of a conversation. We've been running a program in North Carolina with some pastors there who are predominantly serving rural congregations in North Carolina, and thus are on the front lines of some of these questions of radicalization around white nationalism that are pretty active in our country right now. And we did a session with a retired bishop in the United Methodist Church last week, and who's had deep experience bridging political divides. And one of his reflections was that, you know, it's not my job to love everybody. I could try the best that I can, but that's God's job, right? And, you know, and we all laughed, but it's also, I think, instructive insofar as, like, we can aspire to do the radical work, I think, that my faith tradition demands of me, which is seeing the humanity in my opponent, even when I don't want to. And I also recognize there are certain conditions in which it is not safe for me to have bridging conversations with folks who would deny my humanity or deny the humanity of those that I love, right? And so I think there is a question to me embedded in that question about what one is called to do in their particular role in a moment or in a season. I'd like to think that I am pretty well skilled at doing work across lines of difference, because the reality of being Black in America is that I always encounter difference and in the context in which I live, right? And that doesn't mean that I'm gonna put myself in the position to be frequently harmed by folks who would run all over me, or who see speaking against the humanity of folks that I love as something that is instrumental to their beliefs. Like, I don't, you know, so I do think it's a real live and lived tension that we experience, and not everybody is called to bridge. Not everybody is called to do the same type of restorative healing work. And so I think there is a place of reflection and discernment that is part of this process, that folks have to ask themselves what they're prepared to do. And I don't believe that work should ever be at the detriment of one caring for one's self and one's community and one's family, right? Because risk looks different depending on how one is embodied, right? And so in my mind's eye, you know, we hold the humanity of our opponents. We hold them and we see them as human, as somebody's once baby, right, who emerged into this world. And we don't necessarily have to put ourselves in harm's way for the sake of a redemptive process if those folks do not see themselves as adequately prepared or willing to enter into a process of accountability, redemption, and maybe at some point reconciliation.
I feel like, you know, a version of this question I've been getting for like 4 years now. Like, what do we do? How do we dialogue? How are we in conversation if someone isn't? It's not a matter of a political disagreement. It's a matter of not acknowledging my humanity. And I'm like, 4 years in, I wish I had a better, I want to have a better answer than what I have, because at the end of the day, I feel like I'm still, I want to be able to say, I think Jen said perfectly that, you know, in the best of moments, I'm able to see the humanity of someone, and I'm able to recognize that they were created like I was in the image of the divine. And maybe that's a starting place. I mean, I've been a hospital chaplain in my life, and in roles like that, you walk into the room and you cross the threshold, and you don't know who's going to be on the other side, and you don't know if they're going to have a white nationalist tattoo prominently on their forearm, and how you sit with them, even when you see that. But I do it, and I don't think that you, Greg, or Jen, or me have any like superhuman powers that make us, the clergy superhuman power that allows us to do that. I think we all have the ability to step into a room and to encounter someone face to face, and to do the work of trying to connect across difference. But I'm still grasping. In the Jewish tradition, like, disagreement's not bad. We're taught that there's such thing as machloket l'shem shamayim, disagreement that's for the sake of heaven, for the sake of something bigger than ourselves. And the best possible outcome for that kind of disagreement is that it endures forever. And that's a good thing. But then there's also machloket she'eino l'shem shamayim, the disagreement that's not for the sake of heaven. And I think distinguishing between the two is hard work, and work that I feel like I'm still doing on a regular basis.
I think what you're pointing to, Rabbi Jordan, is like that it's a practice, right? That we're never going to get quite right. The question is whether or not the conditions are such that it is, I want to say, safe enough for us to return, or that there is a bare minimum of honoring and respect that allows us to be brave enough to enter into some of these conversations in meaningful ways, and return to them. I think this theme of return feels like one that is consistent across our comments. I mean, return and remembrance feels important as ways of moving forward that maybe are not necessarily in our DNA or muscle as a country just yet, that are something that we ought train and strengthen if we are to create something different on the other end of this process.
I think you both have shared so beautifully from each of your traditions some of these practices of remembrance and healing. And you're also both interfaith leaders, I know, because we're friends, and I know the work that you're involved in. And I'm just thinking about this moment where we have a presidential administration with only the second Catholic president that we've had. We have a vice president of the United States who is Baptist and Hindu in background. Black Protestant senator from Georgia, from King's Pulpit, and our first Jewish senator from Georgia. I'm thinking about the potential of interfaith work for practicing the healing practices or the transformative practices or whatever a unifying practice might be. Are there, in your experience, are there practices of interfaith engagement that you think might be part of the way forward in this new era that we're entering into, as we think of the way forward, say between this MLK Day and next MLK Day? What kinds of interfaith engagement might shine a light on the way forward in this work of healing?
Yeah, I got involved in interfaith work when I was in high school. So it's been along in the sort of the post 9/11 context. And I've had an evolution in thought about how I engage in interfaith work. I think interfaith work at its best is when people feel like they can bring the fullness of their core beliefs to the table and not water them down for the sake of a tacit comfort and agreement, right? Like, I think at its best, interfaith work, whether that's bringing people's rituals, practices, spiritual lineages to the table, or for folks who are a part of one of the largest groups, which are folks who are atheist, agnostic, or none of the above, right? Like, that there are these practices and rituals that we pull from that help us get through, that help us survive, that we can learn from one another in, that inform how we think about something like the question of justice, or how the term love shows up for us. I'm not interested in interfaith dialogue that doesn't have a point or a purpose, or where folks feel like they can't bring the fullness of themselves. And so how that looks in our government is a little trickier in some ways, but I would hope that as we have folks who represent a diversity of experiences, which are reflective of the diversity of experiences that folks have in the country, that we might be able to have better arguments, better policy, because it's not just coming from one monolithic worldview about what folks need in this season. And so that's exciting to me. That gets me jazzed. And I think at its best, again, interfaith work is about people being able to show up in the fullness of who they are, rather than leaving something behind.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say it any better than that. This is a moment that I think that calls on all of our ethical and faith traditions to think about, like, what comes next? How do we walk back from the precipice? How do we encounter one another? How do we do the work of repentance? Like, I mean, I look at Maimonides, who took the first crack at, like, creating a code of Jewish law, and then the laws of tshuva and the laws of repentance. He talks a lot about verbal acknowledgement. This is what I did. This is what happened. And without that, we're sort of, it doesn't happen. It takes recognizing what's gone awry. And I think that in terms of our public life and in terms of our political life, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of, what did my acquiescence, what did my silence mean, and what did it lead to, and how do I make things right?
Thank you both so much for leading us in this time as leaders in your traditions and interfaith leaders, and thinking about our theme for today. We want to conclude by giving people some opportunities to continue to think about engaging with these themes and these conversations, this work that has called us into this hour together. And I didn't know, Reverend Jen, if there's anything from Faith Matters Network in particular that you would want to lift up in terms of ways people might engage, or resources going forward in this work.
Yeah, I mean, for folks who are interested in the People's Supper, we've created a number of guidebooks over the past 4 years. If you're interested in this question of bridging, some around bridging across lines of racial difference, some around political difference. If you visit our website, thepeoplesupper.org, you'll find a list of tools and resources that are available and free for download to begin having these conversations in your communities of origin that are meaningful. I also, depends on how political you want to get. Like, if you sign up for our newsletter, we can connect you to some of the dopest organizing that's happening in the South around ongoing questions around racial equity and justice and voting rights and other folks. We ourselves at Faith Matters Network see ourselves as a business of supporting frontlines organizers, but that means we get to see a little bit about what's going on and who's doing the transformative work on the ground. And so if you're interested, please sign up for our newsletter. We always send out resources both around care and how to be whole in the midst of organizing work, and some of the dope campaigns that are happening, particularly throughout the South in this season.
There is some amazing work. We have to absolutely acknowledge that especially work around enfranchisement meant getting people to the polls and really getting their voices heard and voices being counted. Stacey Abrams is a regular on the Emory campus as one of many leaders, leading important work. Jordan, are there opportunities in particular that you would want to lift up around these themes? I'm thinking about the civic dinners also that are being offered through Emory Alumni Engagement, which is another opportunity for kind of coming together across difference and reflecting on themes. And we plan to offer some, I think, through the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life.
I think in general, one thing that I've been thinking about is not letting Inauguration Day feel like arrival, but rather, that it's my tradition that we read the Torah and we get close to the land, and then Moses dies, end of Deuteronomy, and you scroll back to the very beginning and you start again. And I feel like it would be a mistake if we felt like, okay, all that energy around racial justice, we got Warnock and Ossoff elected here. We got Biden and Harris elected in Washington. Let's stop and celebrate. No, we need to celebrate. We need joy as a part of the process. But sorry to get so explicitly political, but I think what I'll say is that each of us in our own communities needs to keep pushing our synagogues, our churches, our mosques, our temples to be continuing this conversation, that it's not done, that it's not all about 4-year cycles or 2-year cycles, but rather it's about the everyday work. And that's where I'm moved by what Jen said about this is a practice, and this is flexing those muscles so that when we need it, we're not completely out of practice.
So true. I think that probably for all of us in our families, our communities, our churches, mosques, synagogues, our country, our neighborhoods, we know that we live in a context of difference, even among some of the really deep differences that that face our country. And if we're seeking to reclaim a soul of the nation, a deeper, I think of the soul as a deeper place of respect and the real precious identity that each of us shares, where experiences like grief and and love and parenting are shared and bring people together. We have the opportunity to find those through dialogue. And so I'm grateful to both of you for leading and engaging in this dialogue today. Thank you so much, Reverend Jen, for being with us to honor Dr. King. It's such an honor to be with you again. Thank you for all of your amazing work in Tennessee. We hope you'll maybe come down to Atlanta sometime soon when it's safe to do so. And Jordan, thank you so much for your thoughts and being part of the conversation as always. We've heard from some members of the community that this was exactly the conversation they needed. So we look forward to continuing the conversation, and thank you so much for being with us, everyone. Thanks for spending the time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome.